It all started one hot summer afternoon when I returned home from work to find HOA Karen lounging in my private pool as if it belonged to her, sipping a drink with her oversized sunglasses while her little dog barked from the edge, and I couldn't believe the audacity, because this wasn't the first time she had overstepped boundaries, but it was the first time she had crossed into my own backyard like she owned the place. And before I even confronted her, I want to stop here and tell you that you need to stick around until the very end, because the way this story unfolds will absolutely blow your mind. And if you love seeing HOA Karens getting exactly what they deserve, make sure you don't miss a second of it. Because what I'm about to share is not only shocking, but also one of the most satisfying experiences of my life. So if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to Sham Stories so you never miss stories like this. Now back to the story, because the heat was blazing. The pool water was shimmering, and there she was floating on one of my inflatables like she had been doing this all summer while I was out at work. And my first reaction was disbelief, because how could anyone just walk onto someone else's property, climb into their pool, and act like it was a community facility? But then again, this was Karen we were talking about, the self-appointed queen of the neighborhood HOA, who seemed to think that every square inch of this community was hers to control. From the color of the shutters people installed to the kind of flowers they planted. And she had already tried to fine me last month for improper landscaping because she thought my roses clashed with the neighborhood aesthetic. This pool incident was far beyond fines and notices. This was trespassing, invasion of privacy, and a total violation of boundaries. And when I asked her what she thought she was doing, she looked at me completely unfazed and said, "Oh, relax, it's just a pool." And as HOA president, I think of it as an amenity for us all. And I had to bite my tongue to stop from yelling because the sheer entitlement in her tone was unreal. But I calmly told her to get out of my pool and reminded her that it was private property, not part of the HOA common grounds. And she laughed and said, "Well, you're away at work all day and it just goes to waste, so I might as well make good use of it." And that was the moment I realized this wasn't just a one-time thing. She had been sneaking into my backyard for weeks, if not months, and using my pool like it was her own personal resort. And suddenly all the small things I'd been noticing around my yard made sense, like the misplaced lawn chairs, the wet footprints I couldn't explain, the occasional towel I'd found left behind, and now here she was boldly admitting it to my face. But instead of escalating into an argument, I decided to step back, play it cool, and think of a plan. Because Karen was notorious for flipping situations to make herself look like the victim. And if I yelled or called her out too aggressively, she'd probably turn the whole HOA against me. So I told her fine, but this was the last time, and she should never set foot in my yard again. And of course she smirked and promised she'd respect my wishes. But something in her eyes told me that she was lying through her teeth. And sure enough, 2 days later, when I came home early from work, I found her once again splashing around in my pool with 2 of her friends, laughing as though it were a public recreation center. And that was when I knew I had to escalate, because talking wasn't going to solve this. And I wasn't going to let her trample all over my rights as a homeowner. So I began to carefully plan a strategy that would not only stop her from ever doing this again, but would leave her with no choice but to face the consequences of her arrogance. Because if there was one thing Karen hated, it was being caught in the wrong with undeniable proof. And so I set up hidden cameras, adjusted them to cover every angle of my backyard, synced them to my phone, and waited because I knew it was only a matter of time before her entitlement got the better of her. And I was right, because within 3 days, I had hours of footage of her climbing the fence, sneaking in through the side gate, dragging pool floats out of my shed, and acting like she was the owner. And when I saw the footage, I was both furious and thrilled. Furious that she had been doing this for so long, but thrilled that I finally had concrete evidence that she couldn't deny. But I didn't want to stop at just catching her. I wanted to make sure the punishment fit the crime, because this wasn't just about swimming. It was about respect, about boundaries, and about standing up to someone who thought she was untouchable. So I started looking up property rights, trespassing laws, HOA bylaws, and even spoke with a lawyer friend of mine who confirmed that not only was Karen breaking the law by trespassing, but that she could face serious consequences if I decided to press charges. And the more I learned, the more determined I became. But instead of running straight to the police, I wanted to craft a plan so airtight that Karen would have no way out. No excuses, and no room to twist the story. Because if I knew her, she'd try to claim she had permission, or that it was some sort of misunderstanding. And that was when the idea hit me if I could catch her red-handed with police present. There would be no escape, and it would be the ultimate checkmate in this ongoing battle, and so I carefully set the trap. Leaving the pool open, leaving the floats in plain sight, even setting a towel by the chair to make it look like an invitation, because I knew Karen's arrogance wouldn't allow her to resist. And the entire time I waited, I thought about how many neighbors she had bullied over the years with bogus fines, how many families she had harassed with her constant nitpicking, and how she strutted around like a dictator instead of a neighbor. And I told myself this wasn't just for me, it was for everyone she had tormented, because once this plan worked, she'd finally face accountability she could never run from. And when the day finally came, when I saw her once again sneaking into my yard, little did she know that her time was up. I stood ready to finally put an end to her reign of HOA tyranny once and for all. The moment I saw Karen once again slipping through the side gate with her oversized sun hat, a tote bag stuffed with snacks, and a float tucked under her arm like she was heading to a public beach, I knew the trap was about to spring, and as much as my blood boiled with anger, I forced myself to stay calm, to stay focused. Because this was the culmination of weeks of planning, and I couldn't afford to make a mistake. So I let her get comfortable, let her drop her bag, let her slide into the pool with that smug grin plastered across her face, completely oblivious to the fact that every single move was being recorded in crisp detail by my hidden cameras. And then I quietly made the call to the local police non-emergency line, explained that I had an HOA neighbor repeatedly trespassing on my private property, that I had caught her multiple times, and that she was in my pool at that very moment, and the dispatcher assured me that an officer would be dispatched to handle it. So while I waited, I stayed out of sight, watching her splash around and text on her phone, completely unaware that her little joyride was about to come to an abrupt end. And when the squad car pulled up a few minutes later, parking just down the street, I could almost feel my heart pounding in my chest, because this was it. This was the moment everything came together. And as the officer walked up the driveway and into the backyard, Karen's head shot up, and the look on her face was absolutely priceless. A mixture of shock, indignation, and disbelief, as though she couldn't process why anyone would dare confront her in the middle of her self-appointed pool time. And when the officer asked her what she was doing on someone else's property, she immediately launched into her usual song and dance about being HOA president, about community rights, about how the pool was underutilized. But the officer cut her off and told her plainly that private property was private property, and that she had no right to be there. And that was when I stepped out from the side of the house, phone in hand, cameras still rolling. And I told the officer I had weeks of footage proving this wasn't a one-time misunderstanding, but a repeated pattern of trespassing. Face went pale for a moment before she quickly tried to recover, shouting that I was exaggerating, that I was just trying to make her look bad. But the officer didn't buy it for a second, because the evidence was irrefutable. And when I showed him a short clip of her sneaking into my yard earlier in the week, it was game over. But instead of pressing charges right then and there, I told the officer that I wanted this documented as an official warning, because in my mind the real victory wasn't just having her cited for trespassing. It was making sure she knew that I had the power to destroy her carefully constructed reputation at any moment. That was more terrifying to her than any fine or citation. And when the officer escorted her out of my yard, dripping wet, clutching her bag and muttering under her breath about how unfair it all was, I felt the first wave of satisfaction wash over me. But I also knew that Karen wasn't the type to back down after being humiliated. No, she was the type to double down, to plot revenge, to look for ways to turn the tables, and that was exactly what she tried to do in the following days, because almost immediately after the incident, she began bombarding me with HOA notices for ridiculous violations, like claiming my fence was an inch too high, or that my trash bins were visible from the street for a matter of minutes after pickup. And I knew exactly what she was doing. This was her retaliation, her attempt to reassert control and make me pay for standing up to her, But the difference now was that I wasn't afraid, because I had the evidence, I had the leverage, and every notice she sent me only fueled my determination to take this further. Because if she thought I was going to roll over and accept her games, she was sorely mistaken. And so I started attending HOA meetings, something I had avoided before because I couldn't stomach the way she dominated the room. But now I made it a point to show up, to speak, to challenge her, and the more I did, the more I realized that I wasn't the only one she had wronged, because neighbor after neighbor quietly pulled me aside to tell me their own stories of Karens. Bullying, how she fined them for trivial things, embarrassed them in front of others, or even threatened legal action over nonsense. And as I listened to these stories, I realized something powerful, that Karen's grip on the neighborhood wasn't as strong as she believed, that beneath the surface there was resentment, frustration, even fear. But what was missing was someone willing to take the lead and stand up against her. And that someone was me, so I started organizing, talking to neighbors, sharing my story about her trespassing, even showing them snippets of the footage, and their reactions were always the same. Shock followed by anger, followed by relief that, finally, someone had caught her in the act, and slowly but surely, momentum began to build. Because once people saw that she wasn't invincible, that she could be challenged, they began to speak up more openly. And what had once been Karen's kingdom was now showing cracks, and I knew that if I played my cards right, those cracks would turn into a full collapse. But of course Karen wasn't about to let that happen without a fight. So she tried to smear me, spreading rumors that I was an aggressive troublemaker, that I had doctored the footage, even claiming I was stalking her. But the problem with lies is that they crumble when confronted with truth. And the truth was that I had undeniable evidence, and more importantly, the trust of neighbors who had seen her antics firsthand. So while she grew more desperate and erratic, I grew more confident and strategic. And the next step of my plan was clear: to push for a vote to remove her as HOA president. Because once she lost that position, once she was stripped of the authority she clung to so desperately, she'd be just another neighbor. And she'd have no more power to intimidate or control anyone. And so I drafted the paperwork, rallied signatures, and prepared for the showdown that was coming at the next HOA meeting. Knowing full well that Karen would fight tooth and nail to keep her title, but also knowing that this time she was going to lose. The day of the HOA meeting arrived, and I could feel the tension vibrating through the community like static electricity. Because word had spread quickly that there was going to be a motion to challenge Karen's leadership, and by the time I walked into the clubhouse, every seat was filled, neighbors leaning against the walls. Others gathered outside, peeking through the glass, all waiting for what they knew would be the most explosive meeting in years. And when Karen entered, strutting in with her usual air of arrogance, carrying her binder stuffed with citations and bylaws, she clearly thought she could intimidate the crowd into silence the way she always had. But this time, there was a different energy in the room. People weren't shrinking away from her, they were staring at her, unblinking, waiting to see how far she would go to try and maintain her power. And when she called the meeting to order, her voice cracked ever so slightly, betraying the nerves she was trying to mask. And that tiny crack gave me the confidence to push forward. So I stood and made my motion clear and loud. That the community had lost faith in Karen's leadership, that she had abused her authority, trespassed onto my property repeatedly, and created an environment of fear and hostility. And as I spoke, I could see the color draining from her face, her hands clutching the edges of the podium, because she hadn't expected me to be so direct, so public. But before she could cut me off, I raised my phone, played the footage of her climbing into my pool, splashing around as though it were her own. And the reaction in the room was immediate gasps, murmurs, and then angry voices rising. People turning to each other in disbelief that their so-called leader had been caught so blatantly violating the very rules she claimed to uphold. And Karen tried to shout over it, tried to frame it as some kind of harmless misunderstanding, claiming that she was inspecting the property, but nobody was buying it. Ow. And then one by one neighbors stood and added their own grievances. Stories of being fined for leaving holiday decorations up a day too long, being berated in public meetings, of having their kids scolded for riding bikes on the sidewalks. And as the list grew longer, Karen's defenses grew weaker, her voice shriller, her excuses more ridiculous, and eventually she snapped, screaming that the community was ungrateful, that without her they'd all be living in a slum, that she was the only thing holding this place together. And the moment the words left her mouth, I knew she had lost, because all anyone heard was contempt, not leadership. And when the vote was finally called, the room erupted with raised hands, an overwhelming majority demanding her removal. A dandlement. And the look on Karen's face when the decision was announced was something I'll never forget, a mix of rage, disbelief, and utter humiliation, as though her entire identity had been ripped away in an instant. And in that moment I thought, maybe, just maybe, it was over, so that I could finally relax and enjoy my home without constantly looking over my shoulder. But I underestimated Karen, because losing power didn't make her retreat. It made her dangerous, and in the days that followed she became obsessed, lurking outside my house, taking pictures of my yard, filing false complaints with the city, even shouting at my mailman that I was some sort of criminal. And while I tried to ignore her, tried to rise above it, there was no denying that her behavior was escalating, and part of me began to wonder just how far she was willing to go to get back at me. So I doubled down on my precautions, upgrading my security cameras, documenting every single interaction, and quietly speaking to a lawyer about filing for a restraining order if it continued. Because as much as I wanted to believe she would eventually burn herself out, I also knew that people like Karen rarely let go. And one evening, just as I was sitting on the patio, enjoying the quiet, I caught sight of her through the fence, standing there in the dark, just watching. The sight chilled me to the core, not because I thought she would physically harm me, but because it confirmed what I already knew. Karen wasn't just angry, she was obsessed. And obsessions have a way of spiraling into something far more dangerous than anyone expects. And as I sat there, heart pounding, I realized that this fight was far from over, and that if I didn't come up with a new plan soon, Karen's next move could cross a line that couldn't be undone. The morning after I saw Karen lurking by my fence, I woke up with the uneasy realization that simply reacting to her wasn't going to be enough anymore. Because every time I countered her antics, she seemed to feed off the confrontation, as if my resistance gave her purpose. So instead of waiting for her to make her next move, I decided I had to take control of the situation. And that meant devising a plan that would not only protect me, but finally put an end to her harassment. And as I sipped my coffee, staring out at the pool that had become the center of this ridiculous war, the idea began to take shape. Something that would expose Karen in a way she couldn't spin or excuse. A plan that would use her obsession against her. Because if there was one thing I had learned, it was that Karen could not resist the temptation of power or the chance to prove herself right. So the trick would be to bait her into a situation where her arrogance would do all the work for me. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized the pool was still the perfect trap, the stage where she had been caught once already. And if I could lure her back in with the right setup, there'd be no denying her intentions. No way she could frame it as an accident or an inspection. So over the next few days, I set my plan in motion, quietly adjusting the placement of my security cameras so they covered every angle of the backyard, installing brighter floodlights that could be triggered remotely, and even adding a new motion sensor alarm near the pool deck, one that would blare out loud the moment someone crossed the line. And then I layered in the bait, something subtle but irresistible for someone like Karen. I left a stack of pool floaties by the deck, a cooler by the chairs as if I had just stepped away, even draped a towel over the railing, making it look like the perfect opportunity to borrow the space while I was gone, and to really sell the illusion. I parked my car a block away and walked home through the back alley, so it appeared as if I had left for the evening, knowing Karen and her constant surveillance would pick up on it. And sure enough, just before dusk, when the air was warm and the light fading, I caught movement on my camera feed, Karen slipping through the side gate with the agility of someone who'd clearly done it before. Glancing around nervously before she marched straight to the pool, tossed her sandals aside, and without hesitation, climbed in as if she owned the place. And I almost laughed at how predictable she was, how utterly incapable she was of resisting the temptation. But this time, the difference was, I had the entire thing captured in crystal clear video. Every detail from the smug grin on her face as she floated on one of my inflatables to the moment she raised her glass of wine like she was queen of the world. Das! And after letting her enjoy herself for a few minutes, I activated the floodlights. And siren, bathing the yard in blinding light as a piercing alarm shattered the quiet, and the look on her face was priceless pure panic. Flailing in the water like a kid caught sneaking out past curfew, scrambling for the edge while shouting curses into the night, but by the time she dragged herself out, dripping and furious, I was already standing at the sliding door with my phone in hand, recording every second, calmly telling her that this was trespassing, that she had been warned, and that the footage was already backed up to the cloud and the fury in her eyes. It was like nothing I had ever seen, a mixture of humiliation, rage, the dawning awareness that she had finally gone too far. But instead of apologizing or even leaving quietly, she exploded, screaming that I was the real problem, that I was destroying the neighborhood, that I had tricked her into this. She vowed right there in front of my camera that she would make me pay, that I had no idea who I was dealing with. And as much as her rant was laughable, a part of me felt a cold chill because her tone wasn't just bluster anymore. It was darker, more unhinged. Like she had crossed some invisible line where logic and reason no longer applied. And even though I had exactly what I needed to take her down legally, to present undeniable proof of her trespassing and harassment, I realized that pressing charges might only inflame her further. And that was the delicate balance I now faced, finding a way to stop her, without pushing her into a corner where she might lash out in unpredictable, dangerous ways. So that night, as I sat reviewing the footage, frame by frame, hearing her words echo in my head, I made a decision. I wasn't going to rely on the HOA board, who were still disorganized after her removal, and I wasn't going to wait for her next ambush. I was going to confront Karen directly, one final time, on my terms, and make it clear that if she crossed another line, there would be consequences she couldn't wriggle out of. But as much as I told myself I was in control, deep down I knew this wasn't just about boundaries anymore. It was about pride. Hers and mine, and in neighborhoods like this, pride can turn into a battlefield where the smallest spark can ignite something far bigger than anyone anticipates. The next day, I couldn't shake the weight of Karen's furious outburst from my mind, because even though I had the perfect evidence of her trespassing, the way she screamed that I had no idea who I was dealing with clung to me like a shadow, making me question whether she might take things beyond mere harassment. As I walked around my backyard checking the security setups I had put in place, tightening the locks on the gates and testing the motion sensors again, I kept thinking about how far Karen had already gone, how she'd climbed over my fence, stolen time in my pool, screamed threats at me, and yet somehow still convinced herself she was the victim. And it struck me how people like her could twist reality into whatever shape suited them. Because deep down, Karen didn't just want to swim in my pool. She wanted to dominate the neighborhood to prove she was untouchable. And if she could use me as an example, all the better. So later that afternoon, I sat down at my laptop, organized all the footage from my cameras, and compiled it into one seamless file, adding timestamps and even overlaying her rant where she declared she'd make me pay. And once it was ready, I sent copies to a private folder online and backed up another to a flash drive I locked in my safe. Because I knew Karen well enough by now to anticipate that if she realized I had this evidence, she might try to intimidate or even sabotage me to erase it, and I wasn't going to give her the chance. But as I finished up, I heard the faint sound of voices out front, and when I peeked through the blinds, I saw Karen standing on the sidewalk with two of the HOA members who used to support her, gesturing wildly toward my property, pointing at the pool area. And I realized she was already spinning a narrative, likely painting me as some kind of dangerous neighbor, trying to recruit allies for her next stunt. And sure enough, the following evening I received an official-looking letter shoved under my door, claiming to be a community warning sign by a handful of HOA members, demanding that I remove my new security lights because they were disruptive to the neighborhood aesthetic and threatening fines if I didn't comply. And I almost laughed at the audacity of it, knowing full well Karen had orchestrated the whole thing because the lights weren't visible from the street. And the only people they bothered were trespassers like her. But what struck me was the brazenness. The sheer gall of trying to use the HOA machinery, even after she'd been removed as president, to keep the fight alive. And in that moment, my decision solidified. I wasn't going to play defense anymore. I was going to dismantle her influence once and for all. So I drafted a detailed email, attaching the footage of her trespassing, the screaming threats, and the letter I received. And I sent it not only to the HOA board, but also to every homeowner in the neighborhood, making it clear that this wasn't just about a private pool dispute. It was about a woman who had abused her position of power, violated property lines, and weaponized the HOA for personal vendettas. And the responses trickled in quickly, some shocked, others admitting they had seen Karen sneaking around before but never spoke up, and a few siding with her, saying I was overreacting. But by the end of the night, it was obvious. The tide was turning against her. Her grip on the community crumbling with each exposed lie, and while I should have felt triumphant, what I felt instead was unease, because I knew Karen wasn't the type to accept defeat quietly. She was the kind who, when cornered, lashed out twice as hard, and my suspicion was confirmed 2 days later when I came home to find my gate left wide open, muddy footprints by the pool deck, and one of my cameras smashed clean off the wall. And though I couldn't prove it was Karen, everything about it screamed her style. From the petty destruction to the smug note left on my doorstep in all caps, "You started this. I'll finish it." And as I stood there, holding that paper in my hand, staring at the jagged scrawl of her handwriting, I realized Karen wasn't just playing games anymore. She was escalating into open warfare. If I didn't move carefully, if I didn't outthink her completely, this wouldn't just be about a pool or a neighborhood squabble. It could spiral into something much more dangerous. And that was when the plan I'd been building in my mind took on a sharper, final form. Something that would force her to reveal herself in front of the entire community in a way no excuse or manipulation could cover. A plan that, if it worked, would end her reign of harassment once and for all. But if it failed, I knew it might cost me far more than just my peace of mind. The plan I devised wasn't something I rushed into, because I knew that dealing with Karen required patience and precision. Like playing chess against an opponent who believed the rules never applied to her. So I spent a full week preparing, double-checking every piece, setting traps she wouldn't be able to resist walking into. The first step was to restore and upgrade my cameras, this time installing models that had hidden backups she wouldn't know about, placing decoys in plain sight to lure her anger, while the real ones were disguised in spots she'd never think to look. Then I added motion detectors that fed directly to my phone, and even installed an automatic gate lock that would silently record every entry and exit. Because if Karen wanted to sneak into my pool again, I'd be ready to catch her in the act. But my real plan went deeper than just surveillance. It was about timing, exposure, and setting the stage in a way that would guarantee an audience. So I scheduled a neighborhood pool party at my house, sending out an open invitation to every single homeowner, knowing Karen wouldn't be able to resist making an appearance, whether to sabotage it or to grandstand in front of the others. And on the day of the event, as people trickled into my backyard, sipping drinks, chatting, and marveling at the setup, I kept my eyes peeled for Karen, because the truth was, I didn't invite them to simply socialize. Invited them to witness firsthand the kind of behavior I had been dealing with. To have her reveal her true nature, not in secret, but in front of the very people she sought to control. And sure enough, about 30 minutes in, there she was, marching up the sidewalk in her oversized sunglasses and wide-brimmed hat, carrying a tote bag, as though she were the guest of honor, completely ignoring the fact that she hadn't been invited. And when she pushed her way through the gate with a smile plastered across her face, the conversations around the pool hushed, people exchanging glances, because it was obvious she was about to make a scene, and she did not disappoint, throwing her bag down, ripping off her cover-up to reveal a swimsuit, and heading straight for the pool without so much as a word. As if my invitation to the neighborhood was hers, by extension, as if she still owned the right to everything here. And while I kept calm, others started whispering, a few even asking her what she was doing, but Karen brushed them off with her trademark arrogance, declaring loudly that she was just taking a swim like always, and that this pool had been a shared community asset, long before certain people tried to claim it for themselves. And that was my moment, the cue I had been waiting for. So I stepped forward, pulled out my phone, and began streaming the entire situation live to the HOA's private forum. My camera trained not on me but on Karen, capturing every smug word, every entitled gesture. And when she dove into the pool, splashing loudly, waving her arms as if showing off, I turned to the neighbors and asked, "Does anyone here remember signing over this pool as a shared property? Or is it still privately mine, as the deed and county records state?" And the murmurs grew louder, some embarrassed, some frustrated. But Karen didn't even stop. She just kept swimming. Then climbed out and walked dripping wet right up to me, sneering into the lens, saying, "You can record all you want. Nobody in this neighborhood is going to side with you against me. They all know who's really in charge." And the silence that followed was deafening. Because as her words hung in the air, people began to shift, realizing just how unhinged and domineering she sounded. And though my heart pounded in my chest, I kept my composure, calmly stating, "This is what I've dealt with for months. The trespassing, the intimidation, the threats. And now, in front of everyone, you've all seen it too." And before Karen could spit back a retort, I pressed a button on my phone and the video montage I had prepared earlier appeared on a TV. I'd set up by the pool, rolling through clips of her climbing the fence at night, splashing in the water when no one was around, screaming threats at me when I caught her, even vandalizing my property, and the crowd gasped. Some covering their mouths, others shaking their heads, because there was no denying it anymore. Karen was exposed, raw, unfiltered, her mask torn off in front of the very audience she needed most. And for the first time since I had known her, I saw something flicker in her eyes, not confidence, not rage, but panic, a crack in the armor she had built. And though she tried to recover, raising her voice, calling the footage fake and insisting I had doctored it to smear her name, it was clear the room wasn't buying it, the whispers growing into pointed questions, neighbors demanding answers, and Karen, realizing the tide had turned against her, shoved past me, grabbed her bag, and stormed off, shouting over her shoulder that this wasn't over, that she'd take it to the board and make me regret humiliating her. But the damage was done, the spell broken, because the board members who were present pulled me aside afterward, assuring me they'd put an end to her harassment officially. And others thanked me for finally exposing what they'd suspected for years. And though I smiled and nodded deep inside, I knew better than to relax. Because Karen wasn't the type to surrender, not after years of being the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA. And if she felt cornered, she'd lash out harder than ever. And as I stood there watching her storm away, dripping water across the pavement, I couldn't shake the feeling that the real storm hadn't even begun yet, and that my so-called victory might only have lit the fuse for something far more destructive. I thought exposing Karen in front of everyone would end it, that the humiliation would be enough to make her crawl back into her corner and leave me alone. But the very next morning I realized just how far she was willing to go, because when I stepped outside to grab the paper, there she was, standing at the edge of my driveway with her phone in hand, screaming into it as though she were giving a live news report, telling whoever was on the other end that I had physically assaulted her during the party and that she was going to make sure the police arrested me for harassment and public endangerment. And though I knew it was another one of her fabrications, my stomach sank, because Karen never bluffed without trying to back it up. And sure enough, within 20 minutes, a patrol car pulled up in front of my house, the officers stepping out and asking me questions. But this time I was ready, showing them the live stream and recorded footage from the previous night, letting them see with their own eyes that I hadn't laid a finger on her. And when they cross-checked her story, it crumbled immediately, forcing them to issue her a warning about filing false reports. But the look on her face as the cruiser pulled away told me this wasn't over, her rage seething beneath her carefully maintained exterior. And for the next week, the tension only escalated, with her screaming at me from across the street, throwing bags of trash over the fence, even trying to rally a few of her remaining allies on the HOA board to call for an emergency meeting to have me disciplined for my so-called misconduct. But the tide had shifted. Most of the neighbors weren't buying it anymore. And as word of her behavior spread, people began distancing themselves from her, no longer nodding politely when she walked by, no longer feeding into her delusions of control. And it was that isolation, I think, that drove her final, desperate attempt to break me. Because one night, just after midnight, my phone's motion alert went off, and when I opened the app, my stomach tightened as I watched Karen, dressed all in black, creeping along my fence line with what looked like a crowbar in her hand, her movements jittery, desperate, and I realized she wasn't just sneaking in for a swim this time. She was trying to break into the pool house itself, maybe to sabotage something, maybe to destroy the cameras she suspected were hidden inside. But either way, it was the proof I needed. So instead of rushing out and confronting her, I called the police, letting the footage record every step of her trespass, every clang of metal against the latch. And within minutes, the flashing lights arrived, illuminating her like a deer caught in headlights. And the officers didn't give her the chance to spin a story this time. They marched her down the driveway, in handcuffs as she screamed about conspiracies and smear campaigns. But no one was listening anymore. The entire street had come outside to watch. Neighbors filming the spectacle on their own phones, whispering to one another that they had suspected she'd go too far one day. And now here it was unfolding in front of them. And though she shouted threats about lawyers and revenge, the moment the cruiser pulled away with her in the back seat, a wave of relief swept over me, not just because the nightmare was finally ending, but because the illusion of her control had been shattered permanently, her reign over the neighborhood finished. And in the days that followed, the board issued a formal ban against her from entering my property under any circumstances. And the majority voted to strip her of her HOA privileges altogether, effectively cutting off her ability to weaponize the association against anyone else. And for the first time since moving into the house, I felt peace, swimming in my own pool without glancing over my shoulder, inviting friends and neighbors who had once avoided me for fear of her wrath, and building the kind of community she had always pretended to represent, but had only ever poisoned. And yet, even as I settled back into normalcy, part of me knew the story wasn't finished, because Karen was too stubborn, too vindictive, too obsessed with power to vanish quietly. And the thought of her sitting in her house, plotting her next move, made me wonder if the pool was just the beginning. If she would try to come back with lawsuits, with manipulation, with something bigger. And that lingering uncertainty kept me sharp. Because with people like her, the fight never truly ends, it just changes shape. And as I looked out at the calm water shimmering in the afternoon sun, I couldn't help but think of the next chapter waiting just around the corner. Because if there's one thing I've learned, it's that HOA Karens don't stop, they escalate, and when she makes her return, I'll be ready. And if you want to hear what happens next in stories just like this one, make sure you subscribe to the Sham Stories YouTube channel so you don't miss a single twist.